driveway looked the way it always did in the late afternoon. Still, familiar, almost boring in its predictability. The concrete held the warmth of the Georgia sun, the kind that settles into the ground and lingers even when the light starts to soften. The house sat quietly behind it, blinds half drawn, nothing out of place. No sirens, no raised voices, no sense that anything unusual was about to happen. It was one of those moments that doesn't register as a moment at all while you're living it. Just another pause between tasks, just another normal day. Jade had stepped outside for something small, the kind of errand you don't even fully remember later. Maybe to grab something from the car, maybe to check the mail. The details don't matter because nothing about it felt important at the time. She wasn't on edge. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't thinking about danger. She was thinking about dinner, about her classroom, about the 100 quiet thoughts that pass through your head when you're standing in your own driveway, on your own property, in a place that's supposed to be safe. That sense of safety is subtle. It's not loud or obvious. It's just there, like background noise you stop noticing. You don't scan your surroundings. You don't measure distances. You don't calculate exits. You assume the world will behave the way it usually does, because most of the time it does, especially at home, especially in broad daylight. From inside the house, everything looked the same. No alarms going off in the mind, no instinct pulling attention toward the door, just the ordinary rhythm of a day winding down, the kind of rhythm you build your life around, the kind that feels permanent until it isn't. A car slowed near the driveway, not fast, not aggressive, just enough to be noticed if you were paying attention, which no one was, because there was no reason to be. Cars slow down all the time. People get lost. Neighbors have visitors. Nothing about it signaled trouble. Nothing about it demanded reaction. The man who stepped out didn't look extraordinary either. No costume, no mask, no obvious threat. He looked like someone who belonged in a neighborhood, which is often the most disarming thing of all. He carried himself with the kind of casual confidence people associate with authority, even if they can't explain why. Upright posture, measured steps, a tone that suggested he had every right to be there. Jade noticed him because he addressed her directly, not loudly, not angrily, just firmly enough to pull her attention away from whatever she'd been thinking about. At first, it felt like a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. One of those interactions where you exchange a few words, realize wires got crossed, and move on with your day. The kind you forget by the time you're back inside. There was no immediate fear, no spike of adrenaline, just confusion. He spoke as if he'd done this many times before, as if approaching someone in their own driveway and questioning them was a routine part of his job. He referenced rules, violations, procedures. The language was dry, almost bureaucratic. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like paperwork, given a voice. Jade listened, still assuming there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe he had the wrong house. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe this would end with a polite apology. That's how most people are wired to think. Resolve first, escalate never. Especially when you're not looking for conflict and have no reason to expect it. She responded calmly. She asked questions. She explained that there was no homeowners association, that no one had ever mentioned one, that she didn't understand what he was talking about. Her tone wasn't confrontational. It didn't need to be. This was her home. Facts should have been enough. But something shifted in the air, subtle at first. The man's posture changed. The calm confidence hardened into something else, something more rigid, more performative. Authority that doesn't like being questioned often reacts that way. It tightens. It leans forward. It insists instead of explaining. Still, nothing about the moment screamed danger. There were no raised voices yet. No movement that would make someone inside the house rush to the window. From a distance, it would have looked like a conversation between two adults, standing a few feet apart, sunlight, stretching their shadows across the driveway. That's the part people don't talk about enough. The quiet seconds before everything changes. The seconds where the brain hasn't caught up to the reality that this isn't normal anymore. Where you're still operating under old assumptions because you don't yet know they're about to become useless. Jade didn't know she was standing at the edge of a moment that would divide her day into before and after. She didn't know that the calm of the driveway was already ending. No one ever does. Inside the house, there was no warning either, no sound that cut through the walls, no crash, no shout, just the ordinary silence of a home occupied by people who believe they're safe. The kind of silence you trust without thinking about it. The man continued talking. Accusations started slipping into his words, wrapped in official-sounding language. Obstruction, non-compliance, things that don't make sense when you hear them applied to your own front yard. Jade pushed back, not emotionally, not aggressively, but firmly enough to assert reality. She didn't consent to whatever authority he was claiming because there was nothing to consent to. That was the moment the normal rules stopped applying. It didn't happen with a dramatic build-up. There was no cinematic pause, no slow realization. 1 second the driveway was just a driveway. The next, it wasn't. The shift was instant and shocking, precisely because nothing had prepared her for it. The world can feel safe right up until the moment it doesn't. And when that moment comes, it doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, uninvited, and rewrites everything that follows. From the outside, from a distance, from the perspective of someone scrolling past the video title on YouTube, it's easy to assume there must have been warning signs, something obvious, some clue that danger was coming. But that's not how real life works. Most of the time, danger wears the face of normalcy. It speaks calmly. It stands in your driveway like it belongs there. That's why the contrast matters. Because what makes what happened next so jarring isn't just the act itself, it's how completely it shattered the assumption of safety that existed just seconds before. The brain doesn't transition smoothly from calm to crisis. It stumbles, it lags, it struggles to catch up. ND, in that brief gap between what you think is happening and what actually is happening, everything changes. His driveway didn't look any different. The house didn't move, the sun didn't stop shining, but the ordinary moment was gone, replaced by something irreversible, something that could never be unseen or unfelt. That's the truth about moments like this. They don't start with chaos, they start with calm, and that calm is exactly what makes the break so devastating. He didn't raise his voice at first. That's what made him believable. He spoke the way people do when they expect to be obeyed without argument. Steady, measured, almost bored. Like this was just another stop on a list, another person who would nod along once they realized he knew what he was talking about. There was no aggression in his opening words, no overt hostility, just the quiet assumption that his presence alone was enough to establish control. He stood at a comfortable distance, not invading space, not backing away either, close enough to feel intentional, far enough to appear professional. His posture was upright, shoulders squared, chin level. He wasn't dressed in a uniform, but he didn't need one. He carried himself like someone who believed the rules followed him wherever he went. For a lot of people, that's all it takes. He introduced himself by name, then immediately tied that name to a role. HOA enforcement, compliance officer, something official sounding but vague enough that it didn't invite immediate verification. He didn't over-explain, he didn't justify. He stated it as fact, as if the position itself was beyond question. Most authority figures don't ask permission to be believed, they expect recognition. He spoke about violations the way someone talks about gravity, like they simply exist whether you agree with them or not. His words were wrapped in procedural language, notices, citations, escalation, not emotional terms, not personal ones. Bureaucratic words have a way of disarming people. They make situations feel administrative instead of threatening, even when they're being used to assert control. Jade listened, still trying to place him. The brain does this automatically. It searches for context, for a category that makes the interaction make sense. Was he with the city, the county, a neighborhood association? He sounded like he belonged somewhere in the system, even if it wasn't immediately clear where. That uncertainty worked in his favor. People hesitate when they're unsure. They give the benefit of the doubt. They assume they're missing a piece of information rather than assuming someone else is lying. He relied on that instinct. When Jade told him there was no HOA, he didn't hesitate or backtrack. He didn't pause to reconsider. He simply corrected her, not with new information, but with tone. a slight tightening around the eyes, a subtle shift in his stance, as if she'd said something naive rather than factual. "Yes, there is," he said, "or something close to it, not loudly, not angrily, just confidently enough to suggest the discussion was already settled. That's how fake authority often works. It doesn't argue details, it overrides them." He talked about paperwork that hadn't been delivered yet, about records she hadn't seen, about rules she must have agreed to at some point, even if she didn't remember. The implication wasn't just that she was wrong, it was that she was uninformed, and that subtle shift changes the power dynamic. If you're uninformed, you're already behind. You're already on the defensive. Jade pushed back again, calmly, pointing out that they had lived here for years, that no association had ever contacted them, that nothing he was saying aligned with reality. She wasn't challenging him emotionally, she was correcting him logically. His response wasn't to provide proof, it was to escalate language. Words like non-compliance entered the conversation, obstruction, terms that carry weight, not because they're specific, but because they imply consequences. He didn't say what those consequences were. He didn't need to. The words themselves were meant to create pressure, to make her feel like continuing to question him could lead somewhere unpleasant. Still, his delivery remained controlled. That was the unsettling part. He wasn't acting like someone who'd lost his temper. He was acting like someone exercising power. There's a difference, and viewers can feel it even if they can't articulate it. He angled his body slightly now, positioning himself less like a neighbor and more like a barrier, not blocking the driveway, just subtly occupying space in a way that suggested the interaction wasn't optional anymore. It was a small move, but intentional. At no point did he explain why this conversation needed to happen right now, in the driveway, without prior notice. At no point did he provide credentials. He assumed legitimacy through repetition. The more he said OA, the more he expected it to become real. For someone watching this unfold, the discomfort wouldn't come from overt threats. It would come from the imbalance. One person standing on their own property, responding reasonably, the other standing there insisting on authority that hadn't been earned or demonstrated. This is where viewers start leaning forward. Because something feels off, even before it becomes obvious. The situation doesn't align with common sense, but it also doesn't cross into outright danger yet. It lives in that gray space where people second-guess themselves. He asked questions that weren't really questions, demands phrased as procedure, requests framed as requirements. He wanted cooperation, but more than that, he wanted submission. The kind that comes from accepting someone else's version of reality over your own. Jade's refusal wasn't dramatic. She didn't shout. She didn't insult him. She simply didn't comply with something that didn't make sense. And that's often all it takes to expose fake authority. The mask didn't drop immediately. It cracked, his tone sharpened just slightly. The patience he'd been projecting thinned. Not enough to alarm someone inside the house, but enough to register on a gut level. The confidence started to feel less earned and more forced. He repeated his claims louder this time, not shouting but projecting, as if volume could substitute for legitimacy. He leaned into his role harder, instead of explaining it better. When the intimidation became clearer. Not physical, not yet. Psychological, the implication that he could make things difficult, that refusing him was a mistake, that he had options she didn't. Still, he never said those things outright. He let the weight of assumed authority do the work. He let silence hang after certain statements, giving them room to settle, to feel heavier than they actually were. From the outside, from the perspective of a viewer, this is the moment where doubt shifts. At first you might wonder if there's some obscure HOA rule you don't know about. Then you start wondering about him. Why is he so insistent? Why won't he provide proof? Why does his authority seem to depend entirely on being accepted without question? He wasn't enforcing rules. He was enforcing compliance. There's something deeply unsettling about someone who refuses to acknowledge reality when it doesn't serve them. It signals that logic won't end the interaction. That reason isn't the currency being used here. The driveway still looked ordinary. Cars still passed on the street. Birds still made noise somewhere nearby. But the social contract had been quietly violated. The unspoken agreement that conversations end when they stop making sense had been ignored. He wasn't there to resolve a misunderstanding. He was there to dominate the interaction. And that realization doesn't come all at once. It creeps in slowly, through inconsistencies, through tone, through the way someone CTS to being questioned. Viewers experience it the same way Jade did, incrementally, uneasily, with a growing sense that something isn't right. By the time it became clear that his authority was entirely self-appointed, the situation had already shifted from awkward to threatening, not because of what he had done yet, but because of what his behavior suggested he might do next. Fake authority doesn't announce itself as fake. It borrows the language and posture of legitimacy and dares you to challenge it. And when you do, it reveals its true nature, not through facts, but through force. That's the moment the audience stops wondering if he's legitimate and starts wondering how far he's willing to go. There are moments when time doesn't slow down. It doesn't stretch or blur or give you space to process what's happening. It just stops behaving the way you expect it to. 1 second flows into the next like it always has, and then suddenly there's a break in that flow. A fracture so sharp it separates everything that came before from everything that follows. It didn't happen after a long argument. It didn't come at the peak of shouting or chaos. That's what made it so hard to comprehend. The conversation was still operating under the illusion of normalcy, however strained. Words were still being exchanged. The situation was uncomfortable, tense even, but it hadn't crossed into anything that felt irreversible. Until it did. There was no warning gesture, no dramatic wind-up, no obvious signal that something was about to go terribly wrong. The human brain is good at recognizing patterns, but this didn't fit any pattern Jade had ever experienced. One moment she was standing in her driveway, trying to assert a simple truth. The next, that truth no longer mattered. The sound wasn't loud. That's something people often misunderstand. They imagine moments like this as explosive, noisy, impossible to miss. But this wasn't like that. It was quick, sharp, final, and then there was silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that presses in on your ears, the kind that follows something so unexpected that the world seems to pause, as if it's waiting for someone to explain what just happened. Jade didn't fall. She didn't scream. Her body stayed where it was, but something inside the moment shifted permanently. Her mind lagged behind reality, struggling to reconcile what she had just felt with what she believed was possible. The brain rejects things like this at first. It insists there must be another explanation, a misunderstanding, an accident. But there was no accident in the way he stood afterward. He didn't apologize. He didn't step back in shock at his own action. He didn't look confused or remorseful. His posture didn't change at all. That was almost worse than the act itself. The absence of reaction made it clear this wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. That realization hit harder than anything else. There's a specific kind of disbelief that comes when a boundary you didn't know needed defending is suddenly obliterated. It's not fear right away. It's confusion. A hollow, suspended feeling where your brain is still trying to update the rules of reality. This wasn't a stranger lashing out in a dark alley. This wasn't chaos or panic. This was a man who had been speaking calmly, claiming authority, standing in broad daylight on private property, and then crossing a line that doesn't get crossed by accident. The driveway didn't react. The house didn't react. The world didn't react. Everything looked exactly the same as it had seconds earlier, and that made it harder to accept what had just happened. The setting didn't match the event. Inside the house, there was a moment where nothing registered, no immediate understanding that something irreversible had occurred just a few steps away. That's how these moments work. They create a delay, a gap between reality and awareness, and that gap can feel endless even when it lasts only seconds. Jade's first instinct wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The kind that makes you stand still because moving would require acknowledging what just happened. Her thoughts scattered, trying to land on something solid, something that made sense. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not like this. Not over words. Not in the open. The man's expression didn't offer any clarity. There was no rage to explain his behavior, no loss of control to soften it. If anything, he seemed more certain now. as if the act itself had cemented his dominance in his own mind, as if crossing that line proved something to him. That's when silence became louder than anything else. The absence of immediate noise, of intervention, of explanation. Silence leaves room for realization to bloom, and realization is often more devastating than the event itself. Inside the house, something finally shifted, the kind of shift you feel before you understand why, a disturbance in the rhythm of normal life, a sense that something is wrong without yet knowing what it is. For Jade, time resumed, but it felt different now, heavier, slower. Each second carried weight. The reality of what had just occurred began to settle, not all at once, but in waves. Each wave bringing more clarity, more shock, more certainty that there was no undoing this. The line had been crossed. There are lines in life that exist even if you never consciously think about them. Lines that define what is acceptable, what is safe, what is human. When someone crosses one of those lines, it changes how you see the world. It forces you to confront the fact that not everyone operates under the same rules you do. This wasn't just an insult. It wasn't just intimidation. It wasn't just a misunderstanding gone too far. It was an act that erased any remaining ambiguity about who this man was and what he was capable of. Jade's body reacted before her thoughts fully caught up, a tightening in the chest, a shallow breath, a thud. An awareness of vulnerability in a place that had always felt secure. The driveway was no longer just concrete and sunlight. It was the site of something that could not be taken back. The man didn't leave. He didn't retreat. He stayed where he was, as if daring the world to challenge what he'd done. That, too, spoke volumes. It told her everything she needed to know about his mindset. He believed he was still in control. That belief was built on a lie. Inside the house, the sound finally reached the ears it needed to reach. Not the sound itself, but the absence of ordinary noise where there should have been some sign of resolution. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. There's a particular kind of fear that comes not from the act itself, but from realizing how close you were to assuming it could never happen, how easily normal can collapse, how thin the barrier is between safety and violation. Jade didn't need to look at him again to understand that the conversation was over. Whatever this had been pretending to be, a dispute, an enforcement issue, a misunderstanding, it had revealed its true nature. This was no longer about rules or authority, it was about power, exercised without restraint. The driveway felt smaller now, the open space more exposed. The familiarity that once brought comfort now offered no protection at all. Home had been invaded, not physically but fundamentally. And still the world remained quiet. That quiet is what stays with you, not the act itself. But the moment afterward, when everything is suspended, when you're standing in the aftermath of something you never imagined you'd have to process, and there's no immediate script for what comes next. Disbelief doesn't scream. It doesn't shout for attention. It settles in slowly, like a fog, dulling the edges of everything else. It asks the same question over and over, even when the answer is already clear. Did that really just happen? The answer doesn't come from words. It comes from the weight in your chest, from the way your perception of safety has shifted, from the knowledge that something irreversible has taken place and nothing will feel quite the same again. That single action redefined the entire situation. It erased any remaining doubt, any hope that this could be resolved through conversation or explanation. It marked the point of no return. And in that moment of silence and disbelief, before anyone moved, before anyone spoke, the story changed forever. The first sensation wasn't rage. It was clarity. The kind that snaps into place without warning, sharp and immediate, cutting through everything else. Training does that. It doesn't flood you with emotion. It strips things down to essentials. But instinct was there too, right under the surface, loud and demanding, pulling in the opposite direction. Two voices spoke at the same time. One was raw, ancient and personal. The voice that doesn't care about consequences or explanations. The voice that sees a line crossed and demands it be answered immediately. The voice that exists to protect, not to calculate. It rose fast, fueled by shock and the sight of someone you love standing in a moment that should never have existed. The other voice was quieter but deeper, forged over years of repetition, discipline, and control. The voice that had been trained to slow the moment down even when everything inside you is accelerating. The voice that doesn't ask what feels right, but what comes next. Those two voices collided in the space of a heartbeat. From the outside, it might have looked like nothing happened at all, no sudden movement, no shout, no visible reaction. But internally, everything was happening at once. Every lesson learned under pressure surfaced simultaneously, not as a checklist, but as a weight. Heavy, grounding, impossible to ignore. The instinctive response was immediate and obvious. It came with heat and urgency, a direct physical solution to a physical violation. That response didn't require thought. It didn't require permission. It was there, fully formed, demanding action. But training doesn't erase instinct. It sits on top of it. It restrains it. 16 years of experience doesn't eliminate emotion. It teaches you what emotion costs when you let it drive. It teaches you how quickly one uncontrolled moment can erase a lifetime of discipline, service, and sacrifice. In that instant, the conflict wasn't about capability. There was no question about what could be D1. The conflict was about choice, about which version of yourself you allowed to act. Protecting your family feels absolute. It feels non-negotiable, and in many ways it is. But the question wasn't whether to protect, it was how. The difference between those two paths was the difference between justice and ruin. The environment didn't disappear. The driveway was still there. The man was still there. Jade was still there. Every variable remained in place, waiting for a decision. Adrenaline surged, but it didn't take over. Training had taught the body how to function inside that surge instead of being consumed by it. Breathing stayed controlled. Vision stayed clear. Hands stayed still, even as everything inside wanted to move. This is the part people misunderstand about discipline. They think it suppresses feeling. It doesn't. It forces you to feel everything and act anyway. The consequences flashed through the mind, not as fear, but as facts. Police, statements, cameras, witnesses. A system that doesn't care about intent if the outcome crosses a legal line. A uniform that represents more than just a job. Years of trust, responsibility, and expectation. One uncontrolled action could rewrite the story completely. It could turn a victim into a defendant. It could shift focus away from what had been done and onto how it was answered. And somewhere in that calculation was Jade. Not just her safety in that moment, but her safety afterward. The aftermath matters, the long tie. Of consequences that follow an incident like this. Trauma doesn't end when the immediate threat is gone. Legal battles, public scrutiny, professional fallout, they all land on the family too. The instinctive voice argued that none of that mattered. That lines like this demand immediate, overwhelming response. That restraint in the face of violation is weakness. Training answered back with something quieter but more certain. Restraint isn't weakness, it's control. And control is what separates protection from destruction. The hardest part wasn't holding back from action. It was choosing the right action when every nerve in the body was screaming for something else. When the emotional part of the brain was fully engaged and demanding resolution now, not later. Time felt compressed. Decisions that would normally take minutes had to be made in fractions of a second. Not because the situation was escalating physically, but because once a decision is made in moments like this, it can't be undone. There was also the awareness of being watched, not just by the man in front of him, but by the situation itself, by the inevitable investigation, by the people who would later reconstruct these moments frame by frame, word by word. That awareness didn't create hesitation. It created precision. The goal wasn't dominance. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't even satisfaction. The goal was to stop the threat, protect Jade, and preserve the truth of what had happened. Emotion wanted release. Training demanded resolution. The internal battle wasn't loud. It didn't feel chaotic. It felt heavy, like holding a door shut against a storm, knowing you have the strength to open it, but also knowing what would rush in if you did. This is where viewers stay, because this conflict is universal, even if the circumstances aren't. Everyone understands the feeling of wanting to act and knowing they shouldn't. of standing at the edge of a decision that could change everything. The difference here is that the stakes were real, immediate, and irreversible. Protecting family doesn't always look the way people imagine it does. Sometimes it looks like restraint so precise it goes unnoticed. Sometimes it looks like choosing a path that feels unsatisfying in the moment but preserves everything that matters afterward. The body remained ready. Awareness stayed high. But the action chosen wasn't fueled by anger. It was guided by purpose. That choice didn't eliminate the emotion. It contained it. And in containing it, it allowed something else to take over, control. Not the fake authority that had just been exposed, but real control. The kind that comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what you're willing to risk. The internal battle didn't end with a victory or a loss. It ended with a decision, a deliberate one, a disciplined one, one that would define everything that followed. Because in moments like this, the fight that matters most isn't the one people see. It's the one that determines whether you walk away having protected your family or destroyed yourself in the process. Action didn't come as an explosion, it came as a narrowing. The world reduced itself to what mattered and nothing more. Not the man's words, not the shock still hanging in the air, just positions, distance, and intent. The kind of clarity that doesn't feel dramatic while it's happening, only necessary. The first priority wasn't confrontation, it was separation. Space between Jade and the man who had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. That decision alone changed everything. It shifted the moment away from emotion and toward control. There was no yelling, no threats, no declaration of who I was or what I could do. That kind of noise doesn't help. It escalates. It turns situations into spectacles, and spectacles invite mistakes. This wasn't about making a point. It was about ending a danger. The accomplice moved first, or at least he moved with intent that couldn't be ignored. Not a full charge, not a clear attack, just a step that collapsed distance too quickly, too deliberately. That's how things spiral, small movements that force immediate decisions. The response was measured, direct, exactly enough to stop forward motion and nothing more. Hands where they needed to be, weight controlled, balance broken just enough to neutralize the approach without creating injury. Years of repetition distilled into a few seconds that looked unremarkable to a Nyon who didn't know what they were seeing. There was no strike, no punishment, no follow-through born of anger. The goal wasn't to hurt him, the goal was to remove him as a factor. That distinction matters. He went down because physics demanded it, not because rage did. Controlled leverage, controlled pressure, nothing flashy, nothing that would look impressive on camera, even if there had been one. Just enough to put the situation back into a state where no one else could be harmed. Throughout it all, awareness stayed wide. The original aggressor was still present. The environment hadn't disappeared. Driveways don't become arenas just because something goes wrong in them. Cars can pass, neighbors can appear. Everything you do exists in a larger context, and that context has consequences. Once the immediate threat was contained, the next step wasn't to linger, it wasn't to lecture, it wasn't to savor control. Those impulses are traps. They feel justified, but they open doors you can't close. Instead, the phone came out. Calling 911 wasn't an afterthought, it was part of the response. Clear, calm communication. Location stated. Situation explained. No embellishment. No emotion layered over facts. Just what happened, where it happened, and what was being done to keep everyone safe until help arrived. That call did more than summon police. It anchored the situation in reality. It drew a hard line between lawful restraint and unlawful retaliation. It made it clear who was seeking accountability and who wasn't. Jade was checked immediately. Not hurried, not panicked, just present, making sure she was okay, that she was steady, that she knew she wasn't alone in this moment, or the ones that would follow. Protection doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like reassurance. The men were told to stay where they were, not shouted at, not threatened, informed. Calm authority, not borrowed authority, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, There was no satisfaction in the restraint, no sense of victory, just focus, just the understanding that the situation wasn't over yet, and how it ended mattered just as much as how it began. Minutes feel longer when you're waiting for sirens. The body stays ready, but the mind stays disciplined. No pacing, no dramatic gestures, just presence. Every action deliberate because every action would later be examined. When law enforcement arrived, there was no shift in tone, no sudden performance. Hands visible, commands followed, statements given clearly and honestly. The truth doesn't need theatrics. That consistency matters. It tells a story before words ever do. Officers assessed Jade's condition. They saw what needed no explanation. They saw demeanor. They saw who was agitated and who wasn't, who had called for help and who hadn't. Those details carry weight long after the moment passes. There was no attempt to influence the narrative, no exaggeration of threat, no minimization. Just facts, delivered the same way they had been to the dispatcher. Consistency is credibility. The restrained individual was released into police custody without resistance. That handoff marked the end of personal involvement and the beginning of institutional accountability. That's how it's supposed to work. At no point was there an urge to justify restraint with stories of training or experience. Those things aren't explanations, they're distractions. What mattered was behavior. Actions aligned with law, policy, and basic human decency. Revenge never entered the equation, not because it wasn't tempting, but because it would have accomplished nothing worth having. Revenge feels good for seconds and costs you years. Discipline understands that math instinctively. Standing there afterward, the driveway slowly returning to something resembling normal, there was no sense of triumph, just relief that control had held, that no one was seriously hurt, that the situation hadn't spiraled into something far worse. That relief doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't soften the violation, but it preserves the path forward. Accountability works best when you let it do its job, when you don't contaminate it with ego or excess, when you trust that the truth, handled properly, is enough. The strength in that moment wasn't physical. It was choosing restraint when escalation would have been easier, choosing process over impulse, choosing the long road that protects your family. OT just now, but later. When statements are read, charges are filed, and judgments are made. That's the part people don't always want to hear. It's not cinematic. It doesn't scratch the itch for instant justice, but it's real and it works. By the time the scene was cleared, the shape of the story had already been set, not by what was done to stop the threat, but by how it was done. Calm, measured, lawful. And that's what allowed everything else to follow exactly as it should. At first, it seemed like the incident would stay contained to that driveway, to that afternoon, to that single violation that had already changed everything. That's how these moments often feel in the immediate aftermath. Isolated, personal, painful, but limited. One bad encounter, one bad actor, something to be dealt with and then left behind. That illusion didn't last long. As statements were taken and questions asked, small inconsistencies began to surface. Not dramatic ones, not revelations that arrived fully formed, just little things that didn't sit right once they were placed under proper scrutiny. The kind of details that don't matter when someone is telling the truth, but start to matter a lot when they aren't. There was no record of an HOA. That part had been obvious from the beginning, but now it was being verified officially through channels that don't rely on assumptions. County records, property filings, neighborhood documentation. Every place where an organization like that would leave a footprint was empty. The name he'd given didn't open doors. It raised eyebrows. When investigators asked routine follow-up questions, the answers shifted slightly. Not enough to be immediately damning, but enough to suggest improvisation. A timeline that changed depending on how the question was framed. Responsibilities that sounded rehearsed but collapsed under specificity. Authority that evaporated when asked to define its limits. What initially looked like one man overstepping his bounds started to look like something else entirely. As law enforcement dug deeper, a pattern emerged, not from this incident alone, but from others like it that suddenly made sense in hindsight. Calls that had come in over the past months, complaints that hadn't quite fit together until now. Reports of HOA representatives confronting homeowners who had never heard of any such association. Different streets, different houses, same script. The approach was always similar. Confident entry, official language, accusations framed as procedure, pressure applied through implied consequences rather than explicit threats. Most people complied just enough to end the interaction. Some paid fees. Some provided information they shouldn't have. Some were simply intimidated into silence. And almost all of them shared one thing in common. They were military families. That detail shifted the gravity of the situation immediately. What had been a criminal assault became part of a broader, more deliberate scheme, not random, not opportunistic in the way street-level scams usually are. This was targeted. Military families are visible in certain areas, license plates, schedules, housing patterns. They're often used to dealing with authority, accustomed to compliance, trained to respect official processes. They also move frequently, which makes them less likely to know every local nuance, less likely to push back hard against something that sounds official but unfamiliar. That vulnerability had been noticed and exploited. Once that connection was made, the scope of the investigation widened. What started as a single case became a thread that, when pulled, unraveled something far more extensive. Financial records were reviewed, phone logs examined, vehicles tracked. The accomplice's role became clearer, not incidental, but structural. They weren't just pretending to have authority, they were performing it. Each interaction followed a pattern designed to overwhelm without overtly threatening. Enough pressure to extract compliance, but not so much that it immediately triggered a police call. Enough confidence to pass casual scrutiny, but not enough to survive real investigation. The driveway incident stood out precisely because it broke that pattern. Jade didn't comply. She questioned. She refused to accept an explanation that didn't make sense. And when fake authority is challenged directly, it often responds poorly. That reaction, violent, uncontrolled, unnecessary, exposed everything. Investigators began connecting names and faces. People who had brushed off strange encounters weeks earlier were suddenly realizing they hadn't been isolated incidents at all. What they thought were minor, confusing moments now had context. The scam wasn't just about money. It was about leverage, about intimidation, about exploiting the assumption that someone else holds power you don't fully understand. As more information came in, the story stopped being about one household. It became about a community, about trust being weaponized against the very people who rely on it most. That realization changed how everyone involved approached the case. It wasn't just about prosecuting an assault anymore. It was about stopping a pattern before it escalated further. Before someone else froze, before someone else complied, before someone else got hurt. The stakes rose quietly but significantly. Federal interest followed naturally, not because of sensationalism, but because of jurisdiction. Targeting military families introduces dimensions that don't exist in purely civilian cases. Coordination increased. Information flowed between agencies. What had once been handled locally was now being viewed through a much wider lens. The truth has a way of expanding once it's allowed to surface. For Jade, learning that this wasn't random brought a strange mix of emotions. Validation, certainly. The confirmation that her instincts had been right, but also anger. Not just for herself, but for the families who hadn't been able to push back, who might have felt intimidated, confused, or embarrassed into silence. For Donovan, it reinforced the importance of the choices made in those first moments. Had the response been uncontrolled, had emotion overridden discipline, the story might have ended right there. The larger pattern might never have been exposed. The focus would have shifted away from the perpetrators and onto the reaction. Instead, the truth was allowed to unravel fully. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the case. Each corroborating account strengthened it. What the defendants claimed had been an isolated misunderstanding was now clearly a deliberate operation. They weren't enforcing rules, they were manufacturing them. The mystery resolved itself not with a dramatic reveal, but with accumulation, with documentation, with patterns laid side by side until denial became impossible. That kind of resolution is deeply satisfying to viewers. because it mirrors real life. Truth rarely arrives in a single moment. It builds, it clarifies, it sharpens. By the time everything was laid out, the original driveway incident felt like the tip of something much larger. A single moment of resistance that cracked open an entire scheme. And that's when the story fully transformed, from a personal violation into a warning, a reckoning, and a reminder that standing your ground doesn't just protect you. Sometimes it protects people you'll never meet. The truth doesn't just come out. It unravels, and once it does, it's impossible to put back together the way it was. The driveway incident was only the beginning. By the time the police reports were filed and the investigation began, it had already moved far beyond a single confrontation. That day had changed everything. Not just for Jade and Donovan, but for the pattern of behavior the suspects had relied on for months. But even as the story grew, the focus remained on what could be done responsibly, legally, and effectively to ensure justice. Court dates were scheduled, statements were collected, evidence was catalogued. Each photograph, each witness account, each officer's report became a brick in the structure of accountability. The process itself was meticulous, methodical, and unglamorous, but it was necessary. Legal systems thrive on precision and documentation. They do not reward chaos, impulse, or theatrics. In the courtroom, the men who had instilled fear in unsuspecting homeowners were confronted with the weight of their own actions. Testimony from Jade was calm, clear, and factual. She described what happened without embellishment, relying on her observations and the immediate reactions of those around her. Donovan's statements were measured. He recounted the sequence of events, highlighting the restraint he had exercised, and explained how the situation had been controlled without unnecessary harm. There was no bravado, no emphasis on his capabilities, only a careful presentation of truth, framed in context and supported by evidence. As the trial progressed, the larger pattern of the scam came into focus. Investigators had collected proof that the defendants had targeted multiple military families in the area, using the same fabricated authority and scripted intimidation. What might have appeared to be isolated incidents were now shown to be part of a coordinated, deliberate effort. The court could see the scope of the threat, and it became clear that these were not merely petty criminals. They were orchestrators of a system designed to exploit trust, manipulate perception, and impose fear. The prosecution presented their case logically, step by step. No dramatics, no moralizing, only the facts. The jury was shown how each encounter followed a pattern, how deception was used to coerce compliance, and how the actions in Donovan and Jade's driveway fit into that broader narrative. Expert witnesses explained the psychological impact on victims and how authority could be abused to manipulate people who are trained to follow rules, but not to expect dishonesty. The court saw that what might have seemed minor in isolation had real consequences. NCEs, when applied to multiple households. Defense attempts to minimize responsibility failed. Every lie, every half-truth, every attempt to paint the actions as isolated or accidental was contradicted by evidence. It became clear that the men had counted on ordinary people's hesitance to challenge authority, and in Donovan and Jade, they had met their match. A family unwilling to comply with nonsense, unwilling to allow violation without consequence. The verdict was decisive. Rutherford Mason, the primary aggressor, was sentenced to 14 years, with enhancements reflecting the assault on a military spouse and the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable community. Ambrose Locke, the accomplice who had attempted to intervene aggressively but without planning or discretion, received 9 years. The sentences were not about dominance, they were about accountability. They reflected the legal system's recognition that intentional abuse, threats, and violence carry consequences that extend beyond immediate victims. Watching the outcome unfold, the lesson for anyone listening or viewing the story became clear. Military discipline is not about aggression. It is not about proving superiority. It is about control, clarity, and responsibility. Donovan's training did not make him violent, it made him precise. It allowed him to act decisively when action was necessary and to restrain himself when it was not. The law favors those who demonstrate measured responses, who document facts, and who seek resolution through proper channels rather than personal retribution. For viewers, the takeaway is tangible. Standing up to deception, intimidation, or assault does not require losing control. The real strength lies in acting with intention, ensuring the protection of loved ones, and following legal channels to guarantee that wrongdoing is addressed. Emotional responses are natural, but they are tools to be managed, not impulses to be unleashed. There is power in calm, in deliberate steps, and in seeking justice without letting personal emotion distort the process. The story also underscores the responsibility of communities and institutions to protect their members. Military families are often singled out because they represent order, compliance, and trustworthiness. The legal system, law enforcement, and military investigative bodies have mechanisms designed to respond when those principles are threatened. Leveraging those mechanisms, as Donovan did, ensures that individual acts of wrongdoing are not treated as trivial but are addressed systematically. In the end, the driveway was no longer just a space in front of a house. It had become a turning point. It was where authority was challenged, restraint was exercised, and accountability began. The resolution in court was not a story of personal triumph or revenge. It was a story of systems working as intended when people act responsibly within them. For viewers, the final lesson is multi-layered. There is the personal act with discipline, protect your loved ones, document everything, and involve authorities quickly. There is the community lesson. Patterns of abuse often rely on silence and complacency, so standing firm protects more than just oneself. And there is the institutional lesson. Legal and military systems are designed to provide justice, but only when leveraged thoughtfully, not recklessly. This story's conclusion is powerful because it demonstrates that strength is not always measured in immediate force or dramatic retaliation. Strength is measured in control under pressure, in adherence to principles, in the courage to follow the correct path even when temptation whispers otherwise. Justice is not instant, it is cumulative, methodical, and deliberate. By showing restraint, seeking evidence, and involving the proper authorities, Donovan and Jade ensured that their experience contributed to the dismantling of a wider criminal scheme, protecting future victims and upholding the integrity of both civilian and military legal frameworks. The courtroom became a space where truth was fully recognized, where the pattern of targeting, intimidation, and deception was laid bare, where the principles Donovan had embodied for years, discipline, measured response, and integrity, were validated not just morally but legally. That validation extends beyond personal satisfaction. It reinforces the idea that adherence to law, ethics, and procedural fairness produces lasting outcomes, unlike impulsive reactions or uncontrolled emotion. For viewers, this creates a sense of closure that is also instructive. The story does not rely on spectacle or glorified violence to hold attention. It holds attention because it demonstrates a realistic path from violation to accountability. It emphasizes that control, patience, and process, not ego or force, produce real consequences for wrongdoers. The narrative closes on a note of empowerment, showing that individuals, when disciplined and informed, can effect meaningful justice even against those who abuse perceived authority. Finally, the story's ending encourages reflection. It reminds viewers that actions have weight, and that the way we respond defines both outcomes and character. By observing, documenting, restraining, and involving proper channels, one can turn a moment of crisis into a platform for accountability and lasting protection. Donovan and Jade's experience illustrates that real strength is often quiet, procedural, and deliberate, yet it is also incredibly effective. It is the kind of strength that can be replicated, taught, and respected. Strength that safeguards families, communities, and the rule of law itself. The driveway, once ordinary, now stands as a symbol of discipline, resilience, and justice. It reminds viewers that crises will come, but the response, careful, deliberate, and principled, is what shapes outcomes. It is a lesson not only in survival, but in the enduring value of integrity, the measured exercise of authority, and the power of systems to work when those systems are engaged responsibly. The story closes on justice achieved, lessons learned, and the assurance that measured action, not uncontrolled retaliation, preserves both family and principle.